the church of Ephesus, and he was always writing about the conditions of the church and how believers ought to behave, ought to be behaving. And there was a problem because there were the Jews and then there were the Gentiles. And so the Jews had a habit of making the Gentiles kind of gravel and being righteous. It wanted to make things difficult for them. It wasn't easy for them. And so here Paul is writing a letter to those at Ephesus in concerns of those in the church. And it starts off by saying, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live. Paul was first letting them know, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions. And as for you, because sometimes we have to get a reminder that you too were dead in your transgressions. Sometimes we look down on people that's dead because they're not saved and they're not walking according to the will of God, and we look at them in their dead state that they're in. But Paul is saying here, as for you, you were dead too in your transgressions. What Paul was saying is, look, don't be acting a little crazy like you don't forget. You were dead too in your transgressions.
All right now, preacher.
Don't you forget, Pastor Pam, you ain't always been Pastor Pam. You ain't always been saved. You too were dead in your transgressions.
Come on now.
Don't you forget, Deacon Snap. Don't you forget, you too were dead in your transgressions. You ain't always been teaching Sunday school. You ain't always been praying. You ain't always been saved. You too were dead in your transgressions. Don't forget, Deacon Johnson, you too were dead in your transgressions. He said, as for you. You know, sometimes that's how you have to get people straight. As for you. Because everybody got a word to be heard. Everybody is an as for you somewhere. Say, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sin. I don't know about you, but I got sense enough to know that I was dead in my transgressions and sin. And sometimes we don't think we were dead in our transgressions and sin because we feel like, well, I wasn't a bad person and I didn't really bother people, and I kept to myself and I didn't offend nobody. If you weren't saved, you were dead in your transgressions and sin. We were all dead in our transgressions and sin. And he said, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world. And sometimes I think that we forget where you used to live. Sometimes I think we forget where we used to live. Sometimes you forget where you used to live. You don't forget that because you even in the natural, you used to live in Inglewood. But then you went from Inglewood to Hollywood and you started looking down on the people in Inglewood. Yeah. Sometimes you forget where you used to live. Mm-hmm. You ain't always lived in the South suburbs. Sometimes we forget where we used to live. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you forget what you used to drive. Sometimes you forget that you didn't have nothing to drive. Sometimes we forget where we come from, where you used to live. And Paul was telling them where you used to live spiritually. You didn't always live where you live now. You didn't always live in the church.